That's enough of the boring stuff. I get to welcome our guest author this evening. Naomi Novik is the acclaimed New York Times bestselling author of the Nebula Award-winning novel Uprooted, Spinning Silver, and the 9-volume Temeraire series, as well as a founder of the Archive of Our Own. Her book, A Deadly Education, is the first of the new Scholomance Series, and I have been a huge fan of her writing for more than a decade after a friend got me started on the Temeraire books. It's been an incredible joy to watch her work evolve. Each new book is a cause for celebration, and somehow, miraculously, even better than the last. A Deadly Education is no exception. It's my favorite book of 2020 so far, and one that I know I will revisit for years to come. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Novik to Northshire Live.
Hello, everyone. Sorry that I can't be there in person, and sorry that we all can't be there in person, but yes.
Naomi, I wondered if you would start off by telling us a little bit about the inspiration behind A Deadly Education.
So, you know, one of the things we were talking about as I like stuffed a cookie in my face when I realized I was like forgot to eat before the event, was how, you know, doing a book tour. The book came out just last Tuesday, so, you know, I've been doing several events. When I talk about the book, I find out things about it. And that's partly because I'm very much a discovery writer. I don't know where I'm going when I start. And very often I get to the end and I'm like, oh, that's what the book was about. But then, you know, as I'm talking about the book, I find out things about it, or remember things about it. And so, you know, one of the things that I did remember actually was, so this delightful tome is part of the Time Life, The Enchanted World series, which was sold to impressionable young children on TV infomercials when, you know, it's like, sign up for The Enchanted World, and for only $13.95 every month, we'll send you one of these volumes chock full of public domain art and stories. And then, of course, they started sending them to you, and they never stopped. So my parents would never let me actually sign up for it. But my library had this volume, and in it was this wonderful, so I was about 10 years old, because this was in my middle school library. And I don't know if you guys can see this. It's this wonderful 2-page spread with basically literally a single paragraph about the Scholomance, which is this school where of forbidden knowledge, where wizards would go, and there were no teachers, and their answers to their questions appeared glowing letters of flame on the cavern walls, and they spent all their time in darkness here. And what I hadn't remembered until just the other day was that I had actually also read another piece about it, which is the Scholomance gets mentioned in Dracula. And my aunt and uncle, when I was a little Naomi, had this book in their house. And when, you know, there were family events, instead of socializing like a person, I would be a giant nerd and go, you know, read their books, because that's what you do when you're in other people's houses, is go and read their books. And there's a tiny little footnote in here. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna like show you all. It starts here and ends here, and that's it. Those 2 paragraphs. And on those 2 paragraphs from these 2 separate books, this idea of the school, this old legend entered my head. And the piece that came out of this book was that, so the scholars would study, the people who came into the school would study at the Scholomance in this mysterious, terrible school. And at the end of their education, there would be 10 of them allowed in. And when they left, the devil would take the last graduate and keep their soul, and they would become his servant. And so that legend was vivid enough, and obviously finding it in two separate books at a formative age made it really stick in my head. I was too young to sort of understand how to find more information about it. I didn't understand how to find primary sources. My idea of going to the library is I went in until I hit a book that I wanted to read, and then I stopped there. But so that was just sufficiently vivid to linger in my head. And then I absolutely became a Harry Potter fan. I was in Harry Potter fandom, which is not just reading the books. I was actively in the fandom, writing fanfic and things back in like 2000, before the films came out. And so I was in the fandom at that time, and the two kind of connected in my brain somehow. Obviously, this is a school of magic. It's not, but Harry Potter is, of course, the sort of iconic for our time, right? Magic boarding school story. And so I feel like A Deadly Education kind of comes out of my fascination with this legend, and it comes out of the way that, Harry Potter fandom encourages sort of excavating the books, picking them apart, finding the questions that it raises in you, trying to figure out, looking for story between the lines, which is what I love about fandom and writing fanfic. And so that, I would say, is those are the kind of obvious story roots. And then one of the other major roots for this story is not obvious, and it's in a short story by Ursula Le Guin called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And what's interesting is that part of the reason that it's not obvious was I started writing A Deadly Education. I wrote the first 10,000 words or so in like 2016. And I came back to Omelas in 2017. And I've read most of Ursula Le Guin's fiction multiple times. And I sort of find myself coming back to it and getting different things out of it when I do. And Omelas, I'd come back to, and it sort of started really resonating for me, obviously in the context of the world, and sort of just current events, basically. And I started kind of grappling with it, and I was working on some fanfic stories that sort of were infused with it. And when I finally came back and sort of really sat down when I decided that the Scholomance was going to be my next project and really kind of dived into it, that work that I'd been doing, I think, was really vivid in my head. And a lot of my feelings about it are in here as well. And so I feel like those are the three inspirations.
Interesting. Bruce actually asked a question in the chat, which is one that was turning over in my mind as you were talking, which was, did you ever find any other sources on the Scholomance? Did you dig up anything else?
You know what? I know they are. I now know what those sources are, but I kind of decided not to go and read them until after I finish. Which is, because the thing is, right, and this was the interesting dichotomy for me, going from Temeraire, where the research that I did was very much like, I'm going to chase down every primary source, try to find out every realistic detail, versus the research that I was doing on Uprooted and Spinning Silver was much less about trying to research facts and much more trying to research, in a way, my own memories. I actually have kind of a terrible memory for events. I sort of, there's a really funny song that I remember that this sticks in my head. It's called, "In order to remember your dreams, you must speak to them as if they were little kittens." And you have to, you know, say, "Here, kitty, kitty." Well, that's kind of how I need to remember my own memories, my childhood memories. I sort of have to coax them out very delicately, or I convince myself that I remember something that I didn't. And I didn't want to mess with the idea that I had of the Scholomance in my head. I wanted to keep that feeling, that emotional feeling, because of course the book, the Scholomance books, is not at all the Scholomance of the legend. It's been transmuted very heavily, and I wanted to do that. But I didn't want, but I did that, it came out of the emotional place. Right. And the emotional core of that legend for me was this feeling, the sensation that I had that this was a truly horrible place, that what would drive people to go to the Scholomance, the legendary Scholomance, you know, that sense that it's an act of such self-destruction. Right. And I don't, so in a way, I don't want to know if there are in fact good reasons why people would go to the Scholomance, because my sense of that school was this, it's literally soul destroying. And so, and that emotional energy feeds this book.
Fascinating, thank you. Your previously published novels are all set in a magical past. And Deadly Education is very contemporary. It's you know, some sort of now.
Yeah.
Was it a big adjustment for you to write with a modern voice?
You know, I have written more than 500 fanfic stories in a very, very wide variety. You know, I started writing fanfic in 1994. You know, and it was just my hobby. Many of those stories are extremely short, and I also write original stories. So, and they are all radically different. I've been in more than 50 fandoms. Many of them are contemporary fandoms. Many of them are historical. Some are science fictional. It's sort of, you know, my brain is a magpie, and whatever shiny thing it finds and latches onto as a place of story. That's kind of where I am. So and one of the wonderful things, right, that fanfic teaches you is, because that's what the readership of fandom really craves. That's what I crave, at least myself as a reader of fanfic, is voices that sound like the source, right? If you nail the character voices, if you nail the rhythms of their dialogue and their speech, then I'm sold almost entirely. It doesn't matter nearly, because of course the joy and delight of fandom is always wanting more of the thing that you love. And so because of that, right, I've written and worked on matching voice to so many different contexts. And once you learn how to do it for dialogue, it's not that hard to translate it into narration, especially, of course, this is a first person narrator. So the actual narration is in a very distinct voice, which isn't necessarily exactly the same as Elle's dialogue, but it's still her voice speaking to you. And so that's it's really good training. So yeah. And the other piece also, frankly, is just, you know, the Temporary series was like 1 million words, I figured out once. And that's on top of the other 1 million words that I've written in fandom. And I feel like after 2 million words, at this point, I'm not really afraid. I sort of feel like I'm going to I feel like I have the tools, you know, and that's obviously the benefit and the value of doing it full time. That's one of the big advantages of doing it full time, is that you feel as a craftsman, right? I've got a big box of tools that I can consciously use, and that's really useful.
It's sort of like the 10,000 hours theory of expertise,
Yeah.
which I've often thought is why so many great authors come out of the fan fiction world, is that they get their 10,000 hours.
Right. Right. I got 10,000 hours before I ever tried to sell a book. You know?
Yeah, exactly. I was absolutely smitten with Elle's narrative voice from the very first sentence. Like the first sentence, and it's snarky and it's rude and it's also extremely lovable at the same time. Was she a fun character to write and to channel?
Yes. I mean, you know, I have to sell myself on any novel project because, you know, a novel, a professional novel, right? It's not just the commitment of writing it. It's the commitment of, you know, going through the marketing process, copy editing, refining, you know, the promo. Literally, you know, it was many months of work to get these blueprints made, which I went to bat for because I felt like it was really, you know, the structure of the Scholomance, the architecture of the Scholomance, I thought was, when you get your book, you will all get to look at this marvelous piece of artwork in detail. But you know, I felt like this was something that could be grasped very quickly if you actually see it, and with only great difficulty explained laboriously word by word. Like there are times when a picture is worth, you know, 10,000 words. And, you know, obviously it is described as well. But, you know, Elle is not going to sit there and describe to you in detail in such a way as to make it super clear, because you know, that would be a very much, as you know, Bob, here in the Scholomance, which is built in this odd you know, and I put as much of it as I could naturally make flow in the text, but I wanted that visual. But that's an enormous amount of work. You know, there was finding the artist who could do it. There was evaluating sample art. There was actually writing out, capturing all the text that described this piece. There was giving feedback on the original 3 sketches. There was refining, you know, there was writing all the labels that go on the text and describing how they should appear. You know, all of that adds up to years of one's life, right? I feel like I have anytime I give a novel, you know, I say, okay, this is going to be my next professional project. It can't just be that I love it. I need to love it. I need to feel that my publisher really loves it and is behind it. And I need to feel like I want to live with this universe for a while. And also that I feel like readers are going to want to live with this universe and these characters. And Elle, you know, Elle's kind of the one who sold me on it, you know, starting as soon as I started writing her, you know, her voice was really kind of crisp and clear. And one of the things about her that worked with that sense that I described of the Scholomance as this terrible place was that I felt I understood almost right away that this was somebody who was having a truly monstrous experience and was finding a way to survive it. And that she was persuading herself that it was survivable, right? That was her first big problem. She had to talk herself into believing that she was going to get out of this, and that it was worth getting out of it, that it was worth surviving this experience, doing the things that she had to do, despite the isolation, despite the terribleness of the place. And so, you know, that feeling immediately, that feeling that I had, that I sort of understood what she was doing and what was happening inside her head, which is distinct from the words that are on the page, which is not exactly coming out of her mouth, but effectively is coming out of her mouth. And so that's, yeah.
You know, that sense of surviving in dark circumstances that you mentioned is one of the aspects of the book that makes it subtly and extremely political work. you know, that felt very much laced throughout. And I wondered, you know, it feels like it can't help but be a response to the times that we're living and you're writing in. Was that the case? I mean, did you feel yourself being affected by the current moment as you wrote this?
I mean, yes. I don't, you know, as a writer, I don't ever consciously sit down to try and convey a message through my work. Partly because when I do, I suck. I try to write, I've occasionally tried to write like nonfiction, like write a blog post, right? And I can write like, I can sort of hang out, I can chat with people, but trying to write like sort of a sustained non-fictional essay where I try to convey a point of view, my problem is that it's just, I can't settle on a single story. And what I have to do, what I found I have to do is I can only tell the truth by telling lies. I can only, you know, convey my thoughts and feelings by letting characters and letting a variety of characters live and trying to give them life, and then letting the things that I believe about the world be illustrated by what happened between them. But because I am trying to do that, I am trying to tell the truth. And again, to come back to Ursula Le Guin, she has this wonderful line that the job of the artist is to say things in art that cannot be said in words. The novelist is an artist who works in words. It is the job of a novelist to say in words what cannot be said in words. And that really resonated for me because I feel like, yes, that's right. And I'm trying to say something true. And I am committed to trying to say it. I'm committed to not putting something on the page that I don't believe in, that I don't, I apologize if you're hearing the siren in the background, which, you know, I don't notice them anymore because I live in Manhattan. But a friend of mine was visiting from the UK, and at some point she's like, I can't stand it anymore. I was like, what? What happened? What? And she's like, there was a 7th siren today. Didn't you hear it? I was like, there was a siren? Sorry, now that I've completely interrupted myself and lost my train of thought. Because I am trying to tell the truth, because I'm trying to let those, something real come out, I think my books do naturally and organically represent the truth that I am looking at most directly at that time. And you know, one of the things about fantasy, about speculative fiction more broadly, right, is as an author, it gives you control over your stage. It lets you choose exactly what you are looking at, because you get to define your world, you get to define your terms and define your ground with enormous freedom, with enormous power. And so I tend to build my characters and story and world. It all builds together, and it all builds in tandem. And so because of that, I think that it's not just, you know, the characters don't just say things that I believe. The whole world operates in a way that lines up with what I believe and what I'm feeling. And I think that that's, you know, so that, and I just, I mean, and I have not sadly, I have not been living under a rock for the last 4 years. It would have been nice to be under a rock for the last 4 years and crawl out and find out that this is the wrong timeline, you know, but sadly, yeah.
So Jennifer in the chat has asked, as you write, do you avoid reading to try and continue keeping to that idea of your story without outside influences?
Well, it's true that I have very, very little time / mental energy for reading these days because of, and I think it's connected to writing because before I started writing professionally, I've always been, and I still think of myself as a voracious reader, even though lately I've been having to grapple with the fact that it's like, I guess I'm not such a voracious reader anymore. Obviously, I'm reading fanfic a lot because it's relatively short and bite-sized, and I can get it on, and the Archive of Our Own is formatted really well and it works on a cell phone. So if I'm standing in a line and I have 10 minutes to read, I'm like, reading fic. And I have so, but it's not, and it's also, I have a child. And yet I do think that I don't know that it's necessarily being afraid of having voice, another author's voice or characters or world, whatever, influence me. In fact, it's the opposite, that I almost don't want media unless there's story, unless I can find story in it these days. I want to really I want worlds that I can really crawl into and live in. And so it's not, I don't particularly deliberately avoid it, but I have found myself, and also it may just simply be, the eyes are going, it's like there's like 3 different pairs of glasses now. And after sitting writing, what I need to do is something more physical. I need to get up. I need to go on a walk. I need to go hiking. I need to be in nature. I need to do things with my hands. I started painting miniatures, and I've been sewing lately. And that kind of task, that kind of sufficiently different making of art is my rest, is a respite for me. And I do find myself doing that more than reading lately, which, every so often I look at the slightly alarmingly, the stack next to the bed that keeps going up and up and up and up. And yeah, so it's not really a deliberate avoidance of other voices. It's sort of like, not enough hours in the day, not enough brain in the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard from a lot of people I know who have not had a whole lot of reading mojo this year. So that's definitely happening.
Actually, what's odd is this year I've had more reading mojo than I have in the past. This has been the year where I've been like, book, dive in, no world.
Awesome. You alluded earlier to the world building that sort of went on behind the scenes, that, stuff that never made it onto the page that you used to create this magical world, which I think is what makes it feel so authentic to the reader. In particular, I was struck as I was reading, there's so many different Maleficaria. Some of them, we get a whole description of their backstory, and some of them it's just like, oh, this thing, it goes through and there it is. Did you have to create some sort of bestiary for yourself, some sort of like reference for following all of them?
So if you go, there's a website, which I had all sorts of extremely grandiose plans for that hit pandemic and pandemic energy, low ebb. And so I'm probably going to do a bunch more of them after I'm literally, book 1 released the same week that book 2 was due. Book 2 has not actually reached my editor yet. It's really close, but I'm sort of like trying to find energy. So the website sort of slid to a distant 3rd, 4th place. But so I had this website called at enter.thescholomance.com, where you can see the beginnings of the choose your own adventure kind of style little game that I'm building on there. And in the back end of that site, I basically loaded it up with a lot of the Maleficaria. Fairly early on, you know, I'm a D&D fan, and I'm also I love the Museum of Natural History here in the city. I've been going to that ever since I was a child, and one of the wonderful things they have there is they revamped like the dinosaur halls, so that you follow along the path of a cladogram, which, if you don't know what a cladogram is, it's basically a new diagram that is essentially invented by, I believe, evolutionary biologists to display the relationships between species. And so, and the way that it works is that each point, each branching on the cladogram is centered on a particular mutation, a particular adaptation that that you know is the direction that that you know what this group of creatures share in common that none of the other creatures in the larger diagram had in common. And it's obviously an incredibly useful way to organize species. And I love it, but I actually miss the old creaky, dark, dim halls where you had where the classifications were sort of the more old school, like taxonomy, you know, where they were being grouped by features. And so when I had to figure out how I was going to sort of sort out my Maleficaria, I kind of ended up grouping them, and I sort of created this classification system for them, where they're in these sort of families of Maleficaria, and so there are some that are incorporeal, and there's like the incorporeal versus corporeal Maleficaria, and then there's like, well, there's this category in between, and we're not quite sure which one they really fit in, and so I have that organization for myself, and I figured out where the mals go, you know, and tried to describe a variety of them. And, you know, and the thing is, I invent them when I need them, but because I have that larger structure in my head, which I came up with fairly organically, probably over the first half of the book, you know, by just inventing different monsters as I needed them. And then at a certain point, which is basically how almost all my world building happens, is that I invent things as I need them. And then at various points, I look back and I sort of see, okay, so wait a second, you know, once you're on like the fifth monster, like, so how do these monsters fit together? How are they consistent? What makes them naturally, what makes them belong to each other, that kind of thing. And how do I describe them more broadly? And in answering that question for myself, I tend to find answers to the future needs of future monsters.
Fascinating, thank you. Michael in the chat asked two questions actually. First, any plans for the book or the series to become a movie? And second of all, in writing a series like this one, you have to know the ending in order to write the beginning.
So I never know the ending. In fact, when I think I know the ending, I'm wrong, as was in fact the case with this. So what originally happened, and you know, in fact, one of the reasons after Temeraire, I felt quite strongly that I wanted to write standalones, because I do think it is important to know the ending, but I don't know the ending until I've gotten to it and written it down. So I want to write the ending before I publish the beginning. Now with the Scholomance, I didn't want to write it as a single book because it's a magic boarding school story. And one of the classic pieces of that trope is the rhythm of the school year, that sort of, and this is a year, the year has ended, and you know, the year is over, slam, and the next year is coming. And even if you literally have all 3 books, right? And you go from, and you put one down and you pick up the next. I still want that. I want you to have to close the book on the year and then open the next year. And I wanted that. But, so I thought I was going to write a duology. And I went to my editor and I was like, I'm going to write these 2 books. And I'm going to give you the manuscript for the first one, but I'm not going to do any work. I won't do the copy edits. I won't take editorial notes. Nothing. You can have it, but I'm not giving you the rest until I finish book 2. And then we'll polish them all off together, and then you can publish. I want them published in 2 separate books, but I want to write both of them. So, there was actually some back and forth about this, but then they let me have my way. They're very good to me. And then, and we made a schedule. It was all set to deliver 2 books. And I'm blazing along. I know exactly where book 1 is going to end. I'm going. I write the last scene of book 1. It is not the place that it was going to end. And I'm like, all right, well, and in fact, I wasn't quite done. The ending scene came to me really vividly. I don't remember if I had just woken up or was in the shower. Those are usually the places where scenes come to me. But it came to me very vividly. And and so then I wrote it down and I was like, this is the end. This is the last line. And you don't muck with it. When you get a scene, when you get an end and it's like, this is the end. And that happens every so often. And I'm good at recognizing when it happens. And when that happens, you don't muck with it. And at least I don't muck with it. But so I was sort of like, well, I'm not where I was going to, where I need to be. And then I realized I had to write a 3rd book in between, the first book and the 3rd book. So at that point, I didn't quite have enough time to finish all 3. But what I did do was I wrote about 70% of book 2, just wrote it. And then I basically sketched the rest of it. Very quickly. I kind of told myself the story the way that I would describe it to somebody in chat, almost like scene by scene, until I got to the end. And I got to the end, I was like, yes, that's the end. And then I went to book 3 and I wrote a chunk of book 3. I got about 20,000 words of it by now. And at that point, I just ran out of time and I had to go back and polish off book 1. And, and I did a bunch of phases and, every time that I sent it to my editor again, I was working on books 2 and 3 as much as I could before I had another chance to dive in. There's the notes stage, there's the copy edit stage. I'm terrible at taking copy edits. I just treat them as another stage in which I can rewrite large chunks of the book. And then ultimately, I had to let it go, but at least I knew much better where I was going. And I'm pretty sure that I didn't send myself the wrong way. That I didn't say anything in book 1 that was wrong, that I was going to regret. And so I did, in a sense, need to know where I was going, but in this case, I managed to, basically I ran down the trail. I got past the halfway mark of the trail so that I could see where I was going down the other side. And there's some curves that go off behind mountains and things, but I could sort of vaguely, I'm like, I'm going that way. And I hope that's going to see me through this one. But as a rule, I generally, my rule for myself, which is a rule that I learned, I think, from doing Temeraire as a series, was that I want more control. I like having the control. I like being able to go back and revise myself. And you can't revise you of 10 years ago, whose books are published and on the shelf and sold. I mean, I suppose you could, but you know, it's not fair in a way. As somebody who's a fan myself and knows how that shared foundation is important for people. For people who want to live inside a text the way that I do, you can't kind of like retcon things. I just feel like that's sort of, you don't want to do that to people. And I don't, and also I don't have the energy to do that myself. Once I'm done with the book, I'm done with it. And so in this case, you know, I tried to get as much information as I could.
There's a question from Yen in the chat. She says, while I was reading, I found myself wondering if Elle is a reliable narrator. Are the other kids at the Scholomance as calculating socially as Elle? And I wondered that too, actually. I mean, she really presents the social hierarchy as life and death in the Scholomance. Is that an accurate portrayal?
You know, so, right. So look, this is the truth of school, right? No matter how horrible an experience you had in high school, right? You can find somebody else who had a wonderful experience, who literally same school, same community, same, you know, right? And conversely, if you have a positive experience, right, in a school, somebody else, same school, is having a terrible experience. It's not that either one of you is wrong. It's just you're having very different experiences. And so Elle is a reliable, Elle is, you know, so in fact, Elle is not a completely reliable narrator, but in a couple of different ways. One is that it's not that Elle is not deliberately lying to you, the reader, right? But Elle is unreliable to herself, partly because, you know, what I talked about at the beginning, that she's trying to convince herself that the Scholomance is survivable, that she can survive this experience, and that she can survive it without having her soul destroyed, right? That's what she's trying to convince herself of. And she is trying to protect her soul. And, you know, there are moments in the story where you really see the visceral experience that she's having, where, you know, I sort of pull aside the curtain and let you kind of see it. But a lot of the time, right, you know, as the reader, I don't want you to read this book and viscerally experience what it's like every moment to be in the Scholomance. That would be a much, much darker book. And it is a book that I myself would not want to live in long enough to write it. Elle's the sort of the humor, the sarcasm, the wit that Elle armors herself in is the same armor that I am putting around you, the reader, right? And putting around myself as I write through Elle. And in the moments where I really let you see what's really happening, right? Those are the moments where, you know, it's true, and where she is having to face the truth of the experience. And so she's not unreliable in the sense that she's trying to fake you out. She's faking herself out. And then there's the other aspect in which she can be an unreliable narrator, which is that she can make mistakes. Elle is not, you know, in many ways, right? Agnieszka from Uprooted is a very clear-eyed, quite a clear-eyed narrator. She understands people quite well. And when she tells you, you know, this is what somebody was doing, most of the time she's relatively right. And, you know, she occasionally has these points of confusion where she meets people who are sort of weirdly duplicitous, and she doesn't get their motivations. And she's like, why? In ways that to her seem so obvious, and yet sometimes you could be like, yeah, because he's a power hungry jerk, right? And you know, and it's just, and that's part of where Agnieszka comes from. She comes from a healthy community. She comes from a healthy family, a loving, nurturing environment. Where in Spinning Silver, in fact, Miriam was so closed off that I needed the other points of view to kind of show you the things that she couldn't see, because she was just like, I'm putting on my blinkers straight ahead. You know, I'm going to get through this. And she couldn't see, for instance, she couldn't even imagine what was happening to Wanda, for instance, right? Which is one of the things that I needed to, I brought in Wanda's voice in Spinning Silver, partly because that's what started me on the multiplicity of voices in Spinning Silver, because my main narrator she wasn't trying to imagine, and she couldn't have imagined the way that Wanda was seeing their relationship, which for a long time was radically, different to Miriam's experience of their relationship. Whereas here, the cutthroatness of the school, there are a lot of students who are in fact experiencing the school in exactly the same sort of strategic way Elle is. Some of them maybe can't, some of them may not be sort of sharp the same way, but this is an environment that hones you. I would say that the students in the school who don't recognize that the seating arrangements are a war, right? Are an act of war, are only the enclavers, right? Are only the kids who have the huge privilege and advantage. And even they, most of them know it. They might not be admitting to themselves that they know it, but they know. And they need to know, because, so the odds of surviving the Scholomance are 1 in 4, right, overall. But that's not really the true odds. If you're an enclaver, your odds are 80%. And so that means other kids' odds are a lot worse. They're not as bad as being on the outside, which is why people still come. But still, when you think about it, 80% chance of surviving high school, that's not good odds. Those are not odds that you want. And so even the enclavers, who are ridiculously privileged in this context, in the context relative to the other kids, are not actually privileged in the world. They are desperately struggling to survive, and they all know that the way they survive is by essentially exploiting the other kids and getting the other, and that's what they need to do to live. Orion is really almost the only one who could, there's a line that Elle says where it's like, the seating arrangements are an act of war, and if you haven't noticed, that's embarrassing. And the thing is, Orion is literally the only one in the school who can afford not to notice, who can afford not to think about the seating arrangements, because they don't actually matter to his survival. And so so I would say that Elle is not wrong. Not every person in the school is necessarily admitting it to themselves. Not everybody in the school is necessarily feeling it so viscerally, but they're all thinking strategically. Many of them had to think quite strategically just to get into the school in the first place, right? And the enclave kids have been trained in terms of, here's what you have to do in order to get out of here alive. You have to do all these smart things, don't make stupid mistakes and you'll get out of here.
This book actually feels like exactly what you're describing, feels like it's very much in conversation with Lord of the Flies. And Elle, in fact, has a very snarky comment about Lord of the Flies. was that a work that influenced this one? And was there sort of, I mean, there's tension there, right? It's not the same kind of.
You know, I would say the tension, the Lord of the Flies might influence it in the negative, in that, you know, right, I think, I don't believe Lord of the Flies. I remember when I read it, I actually, you know, now that you're saying it, I read it in middle school. So I read it probably roughly the same amount of time that I was reading the Scholomance legend. But, and you know, I always kind of felt like, are they stupid? They could all die. What are they doing? And it seemed transparently stupid to me. And I felt, the thing is that, you know, so when I was thinking about the Scholomance and the absence of teachers, which was another thing I had to decide fairly early on, you know, were there going to be teachers or not? And in fact, choosing not to have teachers required more explanation. Everybody, because you expect there to be teachers. It's a school, right? That's the defining thing. You expect there to be somebody sort of being like, you got to do your homework and punishing you if you don't do it. And similarly, you expect there to be summer vacations, right? I expected there to be summer vacations. I sort of had this whole idea that Elle was going to go home to her mom and like have some scene. And then as I was writing it, as I sort of started solidifying in my head the underlying sort of principles of the universe, right? That why was anybody in the school? That was the fundamental question. Why was anybody here? Because it's worse on the outside. And it's so bad on the outside. It's so bad that your odds of dying are so high that you will come to the school even though your odds are still only 1 in 4 and it's a horrible, horrible experience. But you'll come because you're like, I'll tough it out for these 4 years. People compete for the spots to get into the Scholomance. And so as soon as I had that principle in mind, and then the idea was, okay, why is it better? Because the school is designed to limit the access of the Maleficaria to the tasty treats, to the tasty students. And that's where I was about halfway through the book when I figured out this architecture, right? And the architecture is, you know, here's this core of the school. There's this tiny, tiny pipeline that's barely sketched that goes down to the bottom. And there's only the one door down there, and you only go through it when you graduate. And so, no summer vacations. And teachers, no, hell no. No adult who has ever escaped the Scholomance would ever go back there. Nobody, you know, this is not a survivable place. This is not survivable for adults. You know, the only reason that kids graduate is it's salmon. There's salmon swimming upstream. It is the giant herd of them. And there's bears ready, like stuffing their mouths full as everybody's swimming upstream, but enough that they're all going at the same time. So some of them make it out. The ones that are hardest to catch make it out. And essentially by shedding, you know, the rest of the herd. And so that kind of dictated a lot of my decisions after that. And I always, you know, whenever I'm doing something like that, and world building sort of comes into conflict, you know, and something that feels quite core and true comes into conflict with something that I'm like, I would really like to write a teacher here. You know, then I won't let myself do it. I won't let myself get away with it. I don't cheat on the things that feel fundamental to me, to the world. And I think that's what makes the world real, even though it means, you know, there's that popular saying, right? Murder your darlings. I don't actually think you should murder the pieces that you love most. It's that you have to be willing to sort of say, no, this does not belong in this universe. And you have to be willing to be tough with yourself in order to stay true and stay consistent to the world that you're building.
It clearly works because your world always feels very real. So thank you for that. We are sadly actually almost out of time. I thought we could wrap up with one last audience question from Danielle. She said she loves your wild take on the Fae and Uprooted and Spinning Silver. have any other fairy stories, original or reimagined, in the works?
Right now it's Scholomance. The Scholomance, obviously, I think when you look at it, it seems obvious. Oh, it's like a Harry Potter, it's a conversation with Harry Potter, and it very much is. But it is also quite a strong influence of the Scholomance in there, of that old folk legend. So for me, at least, it wasn't that separate. And right now I'm still working, I'm polishing off book 2 and then have to finish book 3. So that's my next project. And after that, I have no idea.
Exciting. I saw that book 2 is scheduled for release in summer of 2021.
Yeah.
Do you have a tentative release date for book 3 that you can tell us?
I actually oh, really? Summer 2021. That's great. I never know. I never know these things. I'm always slightly they tell me, oh, your book's coming out on this day. I'm like, oh, that's great. And I basically, because for me, the book ends when I hand in the copy edits. The galleys, when the galleys come, I sort of look at the title page and I'm like, yeah, okay, it's done. Because when I can no longer revise it, it stops being a book that I'm working on, and it's just finished. And so I actually have no idea, but it's obviously significantly underway, and I can't imagine that'll be more than a year. I think they were hoping to do 9-month releases, and I'm going to do my best to make that happen, because my editor, when I sent her book 2, sent me back an email whose subject line was and so all I have to say is I'm sorry, and I'll write it as fast as I can. So yeah.
I will say that when your galleys come out is always a highly anticipated event at the Northshire, and there have never been actual fisticuffs over them, but it's come kind of close. So we're all waiting with bated breath.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear it.
Naomi Novik, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating and fabulous. I wish we could talk all night long. Audience, thank you all for being here. It was great to see you all tonight. Come on back for Northshire Live with C.L. Polk at the end of October. Visit northshire.com, and have a great rest of your evening, everybody.
Thank you all.